Chapter 14 of Banking Under Difficulties by George Ogilvy Preshaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Beeswax Candle. Chapter 14. Riots at Lambing Flat. As at the present time but little is known of the Lambing Flat riots, I have endeavoured to give as full an account as is possible in a work of this description. The account of the first riot, which took place in the early part of 1861, is taken from the official history of New South Wales, and I have besides given copious extracts from my own notes. In December 1860, serious riots occurred at Lambing Flat, owing to the influx of Chinese in large numbers. Several grog shops and gambling shanties were burnt, many persons were wounded, and a large body of police had to be dispatched to restore and maintain order. The following account is taken from The Official History of New South Wales, 1788 to 1880. The Goldfields, recently opened up at Burrangong, having proved extraordinarily rich, caused a rush thitherwards. When at the end of January 1861 crowds of Chinese arrived on the ground, the miners held a great public meeting for the purpose of deciding whether Burrangong was a European or a Chinese territory. They also addressed a petition to the Assembly, which was presented by Mr. Robertson on the 12th February, complaining of the recent arrival at Burrangong of several thousand Chinese, and praying that such a measure might be passed by the House as should relieve them of all Chinese who had occupied or intended to occupy those goldfields. Unfortunately, peaceful measures were not the only ones resorted to, for the meeting above referred to culminated in a riot. After various inflammatory speeches, a band struck up, and the crowd moved towards the place where the Chinese were located. The Commissioner cautioned the mob against any violence. The Chinese hurried away before their victors. A few tents were burnt down, and while the bulk of the diggers were engaged in shifting the Chinese, a drunken fellow galloped over 2 or 3 of them, whereupon he was locked up. On the return of the diggers, they demanded the release of the captive, and as the threats and demeanour of the mob, numbering upwards of 4,000, grew very alarming, and there were only 8 policemen to guard the place, the Commissioner consented to take a responsible bail. This was found, the man released, and next morning he duly appeared before the Commissioner, who reprimanded, cautioned, and discharged him. A Miners' Protection League was then formed on the goldfield, having the twofold object of creating a body of miners' police and of ridding the field of Chinese. The information concerning the riot had in the meantime been communicated to the government in Sydney, and instructions were issued resulting in the assembling upon Lambing Flat of a body of 50 mounted troopers. A deputation from the Chinese to the Commissioner stated that many of them were starving through having been turned off their claims which had been jumped by Europeans. Riots now became very frequent, and so great were the fears of a general outbreak that urgent appeals were made by the officials to the executive for the aid of the military. A force, therefore, consisting of 2 officers and 42 men of the Royal Artillery, with 2 12-pound pieces, 7 officers and 123 men of the 12th Regiment, and 21 mounted police, was dispatched from Sydney on Monday the 23rd of February. On 26th February, in the Assembly, Mr. Cowper explained the action of the government in the matter, and stated that there had been some difficulty in deciding which officer should be entrusted with the direction of the military. The next day the announcement was made that the Premier himself had proceeded to Burrangong. On 28th February, in moving that leave of absence be granted to the Premier, Mr. Robertson explained the reasons which had induced the Cabinet to send the Chief Minister of the Crown to the scene of disorder. Firstly, that although all difficulties were to be settled, if possible without bloodshed, the law was to be upheld at any cost. And secondly, that under all the circumstances the supreme conduct of affairs at these diggings should be entrusted to a civilian. On his arrival at Lambing Flat, Mr. Cowper was well received by the miners. On the Tuesday following, a great aggregate meeting of miners was held, which Mr. Cowper addressed, refuting the statement made in the manifesto of the Miners' Protective League, and showing that they had no good grounds for the attitude they had assumed. On the following Saturday at Stony Creek, Mr. Cowper addressed a monster meeting of miners, informing them that the authority of the law, at whatever cost, would be upheld, and not until confusion and riot ceased could they hope to obtain any redress. Mr. Cowper then returned to Sydney. The excitement thereafter rapidly subsided. A new rush to the locality called Tipperary Gully carried away miners to the number of 6,000 from the scene of their former disputes, and the Chinese withdrew to other fields. A Goldfields Bill was introduced on 7th April 1861 by Mr. Cowper. In moving its second reading on 24th of April, Mr. Cowper explained that the bill was brought in to prevent a recurrence of the disorders that had taken place at Lambing Flat. Aliens would only be allowed to work on fields specially proclaimed for them. The military were recalled and returned to Sydney on 4th June 1861. It would be well, before entering upon the details connected with the disturbances at Lambing Flat, to inquire what was the avowed cause of these riots. Avowed, because I very much doubt whether the facts of the case were consistent with the avowed cause. It must be borne in mind that for a long period there had been an almost utter stagnation in mining enterprise. The old diggings were not suitable for poor men. New rushes had become things of the past. Hundreds of diggers were scattered over vast tracts of country in New South Wales and the adjoining colonies, digging and prospecting with but scanty returns for their labour. As soon as the Lambing Flat field was fairly opened up, thousands of diggers hastened thither in search of a golden harvest. The very nature of the goldfield held out great inducements to the miner, as in the early history of the field the deepest sinking was from 60 to 80 feet, and in many cases it was simply surface digging. It may, I presume, be considered as essentially a poor man's field. Every man that could and would work was enabled to make fair wages, while in very many instances the yield was above mere wages. In 1861 the population was very large, numbering, according to the census, over 15,000 souls. It is painful to record that a great number of this vast crowd was composed of the worst class of men. And had it not been that there was in nearly every locality a wholesome leaven of true noble-hearted men, ready at all times to stand loyal to the best interests of the state, it is impossible to imagine to what extent the lawlessness would have reached. As it was, even with all the good and true men, it frequently happened that the mob defied all attempts to keep law and order. The records of the police court will unhappily reveal the truth of these assertions. All eyes were centred upon Lambing Flat. Every man who could use a pick and shovel was anxious to try his luck, and at last John Chinaman put in his appearance. I am no apologist for the Chinese. I do not advocate their claims as equal to those of our own countrymen, but still they have certain rights which ought not to be trampled upon. As soon as John got a footing on Lambing Flat, he communicated with his countrymen, and they came up from all quarters and commenced their digging operations. Europeans, as a rule, are not fond of small earnings on a goldfield. John is perfectly satisfied with fair wages. The Europeans take up certain localities, work for a short time, are dissatisfied, rush off to a new place, and the abandoned ground is then forthwith occupied by the Chinese. Perhaps within a few weeks the same Europeans are again disappointed and return to their old quarters, to find they have really abandoned a good claim, which is being assiduously worked by John Chinaman. It seldom happens that Chinese take up new ground. They rather prefer ground abandoned by Europeans. The consequence of all this was an appeal to the gold commissioners with the usual list of complaints against the Chinese, that they spoil the water, are dirty and filthy in their habits, take up more ground than they are entitled to, etc. The commissioners can do nothing, so the diggers will, and at it they go to drive John off the field. Such are really the facts of the case. The water question had in truth as little to do with the riots as the writer of these lines. It was simply that the Europeans wanted and would have the ground occupied by the Chinese. By what means did they obtain the end sought for? The first step taken was to form a miners' league. The manifesto of this body was a strong appeal to the government to bring about certain reforms, and dictating, in rather strong terms, what was the duty of the Crown to these diggers. The document was, as might be expected, a very extravagant appeal for redress of certain grievances which scarcely existed, and even if in existence, were greatly exaggerated. After the first Chinese riot, the then Goldfields Commissioners applied to the government for more police protection, and the response was a large addition of troopers, foot police, and detectives. Within about 3 months of the time at which the events transpired which are here narrated, the population of the goldfields at Burrungong, embracing as it did Demondrill Creek, Stony Creek, Spring Creek, Wombat, Back Creek, Victoria Hill, Petticoat Flat, Chance and Maori Gullies, Blackguard Gully, Tipperary Gully and the Bathurst Road, 5, 7 and 10 mile rushes, and extending over a large tract of country, numbered over 15,000 souls. The Chinese element being considerably in the minority, it is questionable whether there were at any time more than 2,000 Chinamen located on this field. These Mongolians were scattered about in small encampments of a few hundreds in each on various parts of the diggings. One of the first decisive demonstrations emanated at Stony Creek, Spring Creek and Wombat, and at last culminated in a processional march of some 6,000 diggers, armed with pick handles, revolvers, bowie knives, etc., and headed by a brass band and banners. The object of the demonstration was to threaten the several storekeepers in the township, and to fire their premises if they, the storekeepers, continued to supply the Chinamen with provisions. A certain large storekeeper in Main Street was particularly obnoxious to these diggers, and it was only by great persuasion that the mob were induced to waive their threats and pass the doomed premises. The inside of the store presented the appearance of a place about to be besieged. Several of the friends of the storekeeper were secreted on the premises, determined to give a warm reception to the first that endeavoured to force an entrance. The Oriental Bank was the adjoining building, in which a detective police officer and the special correspondent of the Sydney Morning Herald were located, and remained all night, keeping a sharp lookout through the chinks of the building at what was going on outside. Anything but a comfortable position, as the special was particularly disliked by the rioters in consequence of his pen striking hard blows against actions disloyal to the government. So much did the rioters dislike anyone who dared to write on the side of the law and order that a halt was made in the main street, and after yells and jeers it was determined to proceed en masse to the Great Eastern Hotel, and then and there bring the special to summary punishment. On they marched and stormed the Great Eastern, calling upon the landlord to bring out the special. After convincing the men that he was not in the house, they deliberately fired a volley through the roof of the hotel, and spent the night in a regular carouse, camping in the street and drinking to excess. The landlord took over £80 in cash during the night for nobblers. Several cases of gin, brandy, etc. were thrown to the mob to prevent them from sacking the house. The moral effect of this demonstration was to produce a painful distrust of public peace and safety. People were anxious in the extreme and scarcely knew how to act for the general good of the country. It must be borne in mind that this lawless mob scarcely represented the true miner. Many of them were doubtless gold diggers, but the majority were men abandoned to all respect of civil rights, many adventurers of the lowest type. It can scarcely be wondered at that, after the demonstration, crime was greatly on the increase. So far the lawless had got a firm hold of the flourishing goldfields. The police were unable to cope with the difficulty, and step by step the evil advanced till the crisis arrived. In speaking of the leaders of the anti-Chinese movement, especially the three foremost, for whose apprehension the government offered a reward of £100 each, Messrs. Spicer, Cameron and Stewart, it is only fair to state that the movement which was inaugurated by them had assumed such gigantic proportions that they were unable to wield the weapon they themselves had forged. They were not parties to, nor did they sanction the cruelties that were committed against the unfortunate Celestials. They were for hunting these men off the diggings, and little expected that such an act would end in an open violation of the law. Blackguard Gully appeared to be rightly named, for in this locality crime of the worst type was fostered and brought to a climax in robbery, violence and cruelty. Soon after the incidents before narrated, a regular and systematic mode of procedure was initiated to hunt down and drive off the Celestials and burn and pillage their encampments. Sunday being a leisure day with the miners, it was not an uncommon thing to hear the band playing a lively air, such as "Cheer, Boys, Cheer," etc., and see a mob of 2,000 or 3,000 men proceeding under their leaders, with banners and flags often ornamented with the pigtails of some unfortunate Chinaman, to the nearest Chinese encampment. It will suffice for the present to give as nearly as possible a sketch of one such Sunday scene. On this occasion the procession arrived in Burrower Street from Tipperary Gully, collecting stragglers on the way, till the mob numbered about 2,000 men. They turned the corner into Main Street, and proceeding down that street over the main creek, where they ascended a gentle rise towards Victoria Hill. On this hill were located about 300 Chinese. A neater little canvas town could not well be found. The Chinese here were making fair wages. They were industriously plying their callings and interfering with no one. On marched the mob, and as they neared the encampment, made a run for it, and with yells and hoots hunted and whipped the Chinamen off, knocking them down with the butt ends of their whips, galloping after them and using the most cruel torture upon the poor defenceless creatures, in many cases pulling their pigtails out by the roots and planting their fresh trophies on their banners. Not satisfied with this, their next step was to rifle the tents of all the gold and then deliberately fire every tent in the encampment. In less than 2 hours, all that remained of the camp, the homes of some 300 Chinese, was a heap of smouldering ruins. The Chinamen were severely handled. One poor fellow was knocked down by a horseman with a loaded whip, and his head cut in a most frightful manner. It is questionable whether he recovered. The procession then reformed, the band struck up Rule Britannia, and proceeded to the encampment at Back Creek. They met an old grey-headed man who volunteered to act as guide. The march was proceeded with, and after a walk of nearly 5 miles, the larger encampment was reached. It may be interesting to some of my readers to know that the grey-headed old man was not Spicer, who afterwards suffered unjustly on this account. The Back Creek encampment mustered about 500 Chinese. These were treated as badly as, if not worse than, those at Victoria Hill. One poor creature, a Britisher who was married to a Chinaman, was maltreated by the mob, and her infant, lying at the same time in the cradle, narrowly escaped, the wretches setting fire to the cradle. But for the result of this manly expedition, scarcely had the encampment been destroyed and the Chinese hunted away when these men jumped their claims. So matters went on till the police force was augmented, when the authorities determined to bring some of the miscreants to justice. An opportunity soon offered. A raid was made upon a small Chinese encampment at Blackguard Gully, and information being conveyed to the police, a body of troopers was dispatched to arrest any person or persons found molesting the Chinese. 3 men were arrested and marched to the lockup and safely housed within that stronghold. The police were called in from all parts of the diggings, and every available man was placed under arms to protect the police court and lockup. Soon it became whispered about that an effort was to be made to rescue the prisoners, that a grand roll-up would take place that night. The arrests took place in the afternoon, and no stir was perceptible until nearly dusk, when ominous sounds were heard in the distance, and after a while the strains of music, and the deafening and defiant shouts of a vast mob could be distinctly heard, the mob steadily but surely advancing on the police camp from Stony Creek, Spring Creek, and Wombat. On came the mob, augmenting its numbers till it reached 3,000, and on they marched, yelling defiance at the police. Directly in front of the police camp there was a stout 3-rail fence, and through this fence it was unlawful to pass without permission. Here the mob halted, and with threats and shouts demanded the instant release of the 3 prisoners in the lockup. Captain Zouch, not wishing to go to extremes until every effort had been made to appease the turbulent spirit of the mob, left the steps of the courthouse. Having first taken off his sword and placed it in his revolver in the courthouse, he proceeded to harangue the mob, cautioning them of the trouble they were likely to bring on themselves, and declaring most emphatically that as long as he had a man left he would retain possession of the prisoners at all hazards. He told them the prisoners would have a fair trial and could see their solicitors if they wished. The Riot Act was then read by Commissioner Griffin. This was received with clamour. After vainly endeavouring to reason with the rioters, the captain returned to the courthouse, resumed his sword and revolver, and awaited events. Not many minutes elapsed before the suspense was brought to an end by the mob firing several shots at the police, whereupon the foot police, 16 in number, under Inspector Sanderson, were ordered to fire. Fortunately for the mob, the police fired high. The fire only took effect on 1 man killed, and another man, not engaged in the affray but standing at his tent door in the township, was wounded on the knee by a spent ball. Nothing daunted, the mob fired again and again. The mounted police, 24 in number, led by Sub-Inspector McCleary, then charged. The effect was instantaneous, the mob making a most ignominious retreat, helter-skelter down the hill and through the creek, leaving behind them a miscellaneous collection of hats, caps, sticks, guns, etc. Many a foolish fellow will remember that retreat as long as his life lasts. Many a scar from the broadswords of the troopers told a sad tale, one man receiving a sword cut across his face, severing his nose, etc. 4 of the police were wounded, Sergeant Brennan on the arm and several horses, one, Sergeant Brennan's, receiving 8 bullet wounds. Of the mob, 1 was killed and about 16 wounded, the latter mostly by sabre cuts. The small number of casualties may be attributed solely to the darkness of the night. The commissioners present on the occasion were Messrs. Griffin, Lynch, Clark and Fitzsimmons. No attempt was made to take any fresh prisoners. All the police were anxious to do was to hold their own. The poor fellow, Lupton, who was killed, was conveyed to the Empire Hotel, where it was ascertained that he had been shot through the heart. The mob being routed, the next question was how were the police still to hold possession of the prisoners. Captain Zouch made inquiries as to what programme was to be promulgated next by the rioters, and it became certain that a more determined and well-matured plan was propounded to rescue the prisoners and make a terrible example of the police. To this end, it was believed by the police authorities that large numbers of guns and other firearms had been put into requisition. Some thousands of bullets had been moulded to attack the camp on the next opportunity and release their comrades from custody. The police force had been under arms with their horses as long as it was prudent. The ammunition was exhausted, and they were consequently not in a position to resist a second attack, which certainly would have followed. There being no chance of obtaining reinforcements from Sydney, 300 miles distant, in time to quell the riot, Captain Zouch and the Gold Commissioners consulted together, and determined to effect a retreat to Yass, 65 miles distant, and there wait reinforcements. Such the determination being arrived at, the whole of the police force, together with the commissioners, beat a retreat, opened the prison doors, and released the 3 prisoners with others charged with other offences, and thus left the goldfield to the mercy of a mob. The several banking establishments conveyed their specie, etc., away during the night, and then, to add to the consternation and alarm, it was discovered early next morning that the courthouse had been burnt down to the ground. It was never satisfactorily proved who caused the courthouse to be fired, but it was generally believed to be the act of a poor insane man who was liberated from custody and who was to be taken to the madhouse. So ended the first riot at Lambing Flat. Poor Lupton was buried, some 3,000 people following his remains to the cemetery, where an oration was made by one of the leaders. 15,000 souls without a solitary policeman was a nice state of affairs. Yet strange to say, there was very little crime during the interregnum. Talk of martial law and all the concomitant evils were first indulged in, and at length it was determined to dispatch a detachment of military and men-of-war sailors from Sydney to the Flat. The force sent on this occasion consisted of 1 detachment of the 12th Regiment, 1 party of artillery with 1 gun, 75 marines from the Fawn under Captain Cato, and 20 police, in all about 200 men, the whole commanded by Colonel Kempt. The march from Sydney was long and tedious, but at length the force arrived, and inspired the people with renewed confidence. Captain Lovell's artillery were looked upon with wonder and admiration. The military soon settled in their new quarters, when no fear was entertained of any attempt to renew the already defunct riots. The morning after their arrival, a force of 100 men, consisting of sailors, foot police, and a part of the 12th Regiment, under the directions of Captains McCleary, Wilkie, and Cater, proceeded to Tipperary Gully and arrested the following men: Patrick Leaveney and Bernard Burns for the riots of the 30th of June, William Mackay and Stenson for riots on the 14th July, John Nesbitt and Edward Rolland for robbery, and Henry Kilseki, deserter from the ship Nile. No resistance of any kind was offered, the appearance of Inspector Sanderson causing only a feeble attempt to joe the crowd. The ship's gun, or as it is more generally called, the bull pup, accompanied the forces. So ended what was considered by many to be a governmental farce, costing the country at least £50,000. Not one of the leaders had yet been arrested, although £100 reward for each was offered. At length, weary and worn out through being constantly on the qui-vive, 2 of the leaders gave themselves up to the police by the hands of a friend, thus obtained the reward, and were brought up for trial and acquitted. The last one, Spicer, by what was considered to be a miscarriage of justice, was convicted and suffered imprisonment in the Berrima jail. As stated, the cost to the country was £50,000. I have endeavoured to get particulars as to how this amount was made up, but have been unsuccessful. The only reliable information that I can gather is that amount voted for first expedition was £9,506, 17 shillings and 7pence. Further amount voted, £1,500. Amount voted for second expedition, £9,630, 9 shillings 9pence. Amount voted for maintenance of military at Lambing Flat, £500. Amount voted for ration supply to Chinamen, £2,099. Compensation to Chinese, £4,240. Total, £27,476, 7 shillings 4pence. This, however, was only about half the actual cost. I am informed on good authority that it was stated in the Legislative Assembly that when the discussion on the riots took place that the cost of the country was £50,000. From the financial statement of the Honourable Elias Carpenter Weeks, made on 7th August 1862, as reported by the Sydney Morning Herald, the following paragraph appears. There is a sum for £2,099 for rations supplied to the Chinese during the Burrungong riots. It is well known that the Chinese were off the Burrungong goldfields during these riots. They took refuge at a squattage on the road to Yass, where they were absolutely starving. The owner of the squattage undertook to supply them with sufficient food to keep them from starving. They were kept there in this way for some time, but no longer than was actually necessary, and the cost of rations supplied was £2,099. There is next a sum of £4,240 for compensation made to Chinese for losses sustained by them during the Burrungong riots. This has been found to be a most tedious and difficult matter to settle. There were no less than 1,568 claims made, and of these 706 were admitted. The amount claimed was £40,623, 9 shillings 9pence, whilst the amount admitted or proved out of this was £4,240. End of chapter 14.